It is 48 hours since Vladimir Putin recognized the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, two Russian separatist-controlled regions of eastern Ukraine. It's still unclear precisely what the impact of that provocative move will be. Russian troops have already been ordered into the area, but whether this will lead to direct fighting between the Russian and Ukrainian militaries will likely depend on where Putin intends the borders of the new republics of Donetsk and Luhansk to be. This BBC map shows in orange the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk which are currently controlled by separatists. As you can see, there are still large parts of both regions under Ukrainian control. So will Russia fight for the rest of them? Putin was asked about that yesterday.
As for the borders, what borders will be recognized as the borders of these republics? We have already recognized them. That means we have recognized all fundamental documents and their constitution. And constitution determines the borders of Donetsk and Lugansk regions while they were part of Ukraine. But we are counting on resolution of all these differences. That these differences will be sorted out between Kiev government and Lugansk and Donetsk regions. But for the moment, we understand that this is probably impossible in this current situation. But we're hoping for this to happen in the future.
So that was somewhat ambiguous. Russia, Putin says, has recognized the entire regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, but he suggests their final borders could be settled in negotiations with Ukraine. Also in that same conference, Putin reiterated his broader demands.
The best solution would be for the authorities in Kiev to give up their ambition to join NATO and adopt neutrality. But if our so-called partners pump Ukraine full of modern weapons, a solution will become impossible. So the most important thing is that Ukraine should demilitarize.
Whether Putin's recent actions will give Ukraine the confidence to demilitarize is doubtful. In any case, this morning the Russian leader suggested his country was still open to dialogue with the West.
Our country stays open for direct and honest dialogue, for the search of diplomatic solutions for the most complex issues. But I will repeat, Russia's interests, our citizens' safety, are absolute. So we will continue strengthening and developing our army and navy, increasing their efficiency, providing them with the most advanced equipment.
That's the latest from the Kremlin. What are the Ukrainian leadership? After Putin ordered troops into eastern Ukraine, President Zelensky gave this address.
Ми віддані мирному і дипломатичному шляху. І будемо йти ним і тільки ним. Ми на своїй землі. Ми нічого і нікого не боїмось. Ми нічого і нікому не винні. І ми нічого і нікому не віддамо. І ми в цьому впевнені. Бо зараз не лютий 2014 року, а лютий 2022. Інша країна, інша армія, одна мета – це мир. Мир в Україні. Слава Україні! Ми віддані політико-дипломатичному врегулюванню і не піддаємось на будь-які провокації. Наші кордони надійно захищені, створено систему територіальної оборони. Наші партнери нас підтримують. Відповідно до статті 51 Статуту ООН, Україна залишає за собою право на індивідуальну і колективну самооборону.
Zelensky is today preparing to impose a state of emergency across Ukraine. The country has called up army reservists, and it has encouraged Ukrainians currently based in Russia to immediately leave. The blunt truth, though, is that Ukraine's military will be no match for Russia's. That means the West are relying on sanctions to try and dissuade Putin from going any further into the country. For its part, the UK has so far announced sanctions against 5 Russian banks and 3 oligarchs. Bill Browder, a UK-based campaigner for Magnitsky sanctions, called the package pretty tepid and pointed out that oligarchs had already been on the US sanctions list since 2018. The US have also announced sanctions. They will be targeting two major Russian banks and the country's sovereign debt, meaning Putin's government can't raise funds on international markets. The US also announced they would be moving additional troops into the Russian-bordering NATO member states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, though President Biden insisted this was purely a defensive measure.
Let me be clear. These are totally defensive moves on our part. We have no intention of fighting Russia. We want to send an unmistakable message, though, that the United States, together with our allies, will defend every inch of NATO territory and abide by the commitments we made to NATO.
Meanwhile, the EU has announced a list of 27 individuals and entities that have been blacklisted as part of its first tranche of sanctions. They include Putin's chief of staff, his defense minister, two of his deputy prime ministers, and the heads of Russia's navy, army, and air force. All have had their assets frozen and are banned from entering the EU. The most significant cost imposed on Russia so far, though, is the German decision to cancel or at least pause the opening of the gas pipeline Nord Stream 2. In response to that decision, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev hit back, saying, "Welcome to the brave new world where Europeans are very soon going to pay 2,000 euros for 1,000 cubic meters of natural gas." So, how should we make sense of this escalation from Russia and what is likely to happen next? Earlier today, I spoke to Anatol Lieven, a former Times correspondent for the former Soviet Union and author of Ukraine and Russia, Fraternal Rivals. Anatol is one of the thinkers who has encouraged the West to compromise with Russia and who sees the latest escalation as principally a consequence of the West's failure to concede on NATO expansion and Ukraine's abandonment of the Minsk Accord. That was the agreement signed between Russia and Ukraine in 2015, which would have guaranteed autonomy but not independence to Donetsk and Luhansk. I kicked off my conversation with Anatol by asking why, if Putin has legitimate motivations, he has relied on lies to justify his actions. Those include the wild claim that Ukraine is committing genocide in the Donbas and the warning that Kiev is developing nuclear weapons.
Russia is now engaging in war propaganda, there's no question about it. But it did not do so initially in December, as diplomatic efforts failed. So the war propaganda is rising, and yeah, absolutely, much of Russian propaganda is absolutely mendacious, total lie. Of course, there is no Ukrainian genocide. Of course, Ukraine is not developing nuclear weapons, but on the issues of NATO expansion and the Western withdrawal from arms control agreements, or the US withdrawal in some cases, I mean, there Russia does have a much more legitimate case. So, as always, one has to unpick, what is to some degree true in Russia's case and what is a lie.
If there is war, what would Putin's endgame be? Say there are no concessions made, there are no agreements. People are suggesting he could take the whole of Ukraine, occupy Kiev. To me, that just seems so costly. I can't see how it could work. Where do you see this escalating to, and how would that be in Putin's benefit?
Well, there could be a limited escalation in the Donbas. As has been pointed out, the Donbas republics only cover about half, the separatist republics only cover about half the territory of the administrative provinces of the Donbas. And so what you could see is, I think, a manufactured case, an invented Ukrainian attack, which would then lead to Russia taking more territory in the Donbas, but confining its action to the Donbas, and then once again saying to Ukraine and the West, look, we've demonstrated our determination. Can we now talk again? Oh, and by the way, yet again, the West has demonstrated that it won't fight to defend Ukraine. So there could be a limited escalation. But if Russia launches a full-scale invasion of the rest of Ukraine, my own view is, and obviously, I'm not inside Putin's head. Nobody is except Putin. But nothing I'm hearing suggests that Russia would go as far as Kiev or Western Ukraine, because then they would face massive public resistance for sure. And if they tried to prolong their occupation, they would face guerrilla war. They would face massive protests, which they might have to put down by shooting large numbers of people. And above all, I don't think in those areas they would find anybody who would run Ukraine for them. This is not Hungary and Czechoslovakia, where you had during the Cold War, where you had communist parties, in place, whose officials you could appoint to run the countries. I don't see how they could possibly administer the whole of Ukraine. So my view is that if, God forbid, there is a wider invasion, they will occupy more of the mainly Russian-speaking areas of the east and south of the country, where they would hope, perhaps wrongly, by the way, they could very well be wrong about this, that they would have enough local support to be able to create the appearance of a popular government or governments there, as they have in the Donbas. And then we would see what the next move was. It could be, of course, doing what they've done in the Donbas and recognizing the independence of these places and therefore permanently breaking up Ukraine. Or it could be an offer to reunify Ukraine, but on the basis of federalism and neutrality. In other words, we will withdraw, all our troops, but the Russian-speaking areas have to have autonomy. Ukraine becomes a federation, effectively, which, from a Russian point of view, would guarantee that Russia would have a permanent stake within Ukraine and block Ukraine's movement towards the West. Which of those two options Russia would adopt in the event of an invasion, I do not know. And by the way, the thing about wars is, as from the vast majority of wars, including, of course, America's wars over the past generation, you never know in advance how they're going to turn out. And by the way, how they turn out at the start, as in Afghanistan and Iraq, may look totally different from how they turn out later on. So much, obviously, would depend, in the event of war, on how the war goes, how hard the Ukrainian army fights, whether Russia does have any real support in the areas of Ukraine it occupies. We would have to see, but an awful lot would depend simply on the course of the war.
We've seen the first tranche of sanctions from the United States, from the EU, and from Britain. Do any of those strike you as the kind of sanctions that could affect Putin's reasoning? Do you think there are any sanctions that would affect Putin's reasoning in this case?
These sanctions won't, no. I mean, the threat of much deeper sanctions, I think, has affected Russia's reasoning. After all, it is now 2 months since the original Russian démarche. And it's, a long time since, from Russia's point of view, the Minsk process has died. So clearly, the threat of intensified sanctions has affected Russian behavior. But, I mean, if Russia decides to go to war, then it will do so, in the conviction that it will face much heavier sanctions. Of course, there is one other point to be made, which is that NATO, the USA, all NATO governments have stated explicitly again and again, we are not going to fight to defend Ukraine. We've even withdrawn our diplomats from Ukraine. American diplomats have moved to the far west of the country and have been told to sleep in Poland because it's too dangerous now to sleep in Ukraine. Now, I mean, at that point, what on earth does keeping open a possible offer of future NATO membership to Ukraine mean, if it is absolutely certain that we will never fight Russia? I mean, what is this nonsense? To be honest, I mean, you talked about Russian propaganda. Well, there is also mendacious Western propaganda, and this particular part of Western propaganda seems to me virtually surreal in its open insincerity. If we're not going to fight to defend Ukraine, then we're not going to offer NATO membership to Ukraine. It's as simple as that.